My dad punched me in the face, then dragged me out by my hair in front of 75 guests at my brother's promotion party. My brother cheered and said I deserved it. No one stepped in, but what they did not know was that I made one call. By morning, everything had changed. My name is Allison, and I am 33 years old. I work as a senior forensic accountant on Wall Street, but my family has always treated me like a lowly data entry clerk. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who underestimated your worth. Trust me, you will want to hear how their precious empire crumbled. The sheer force of my father's fist connecting with my jaw sent me crashing to the polished marble floor of the Ritz-Carlton Grand Hall. The sharp crack of breaking glass echoed like a gunshot through the room as my champagne flute shattered into dozens of jagged pieces around me. The lively jazz music playing in the background seemed to stop abruptly, cut off by the collective gasp of the crowd. 75 guests, including top-tier investors, local politicians, and wealthy socialites, all fell dead silent. I tasted copper immediately. Warm blood trickled down from the corner of my mouth, dripping onto the pristine white collar of my suit blouse. My ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine, and the entire room spun for a fraction of a second. The heavy crystal of the chandelier above seemed to sway, casting fractured, dizzying light across the ceiling. My pulse pounded in my ears, a rhythmic drumming that almost drowned out the excited whispers of the guests. I slowly pushed myself up onto my elbows, feeling the icy cold marble beneath my bare palms. Several shards of crystal dug into my skin, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the profound absurdity of the situation. Not a single person in that opulent room stepped forward to help me. I looked up through the blur of my own hair falling across my face. My father Richard stood towering over me. His face was a dark, furious shade of red, and the veins in his neck were bulging against his expensive silk tie. He looked like a wild animal wearing a tailored tuxedo. "You embarrassed this family," my father roared, his voice booming across the silent ballroom and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He pointed a trembling finger down at me, his eyes filled with absolute disgust. "You are just jealous because your brother became the chief executive officer of Apex Freight today. You cannot stand to see Cameron succeed while you are nothing but a lowly accountant, right? You had to come here and ruin the biggest night of his life because you are a bitter, lonely woman." His words were designed to humiliate me, to strip away my dignity in front of the most powerful people in the city. He wanted everyone to see me as the pathetic, envious sister who could not handle her brother's success. I glanced past his expensive Italian leather shoes and saw my brother Cameron standing near a massive ice sculpture. Cameron was holding a glass of scotch, a smug, satisfied grin plastered across his face. He actually clapped his hands together when I hit the ground. He cheered for our father. Standing right beside Cameron was his wife, Jada. She comes from a powerful political family here in Chicago, a wealthy African-American dynasty that my parents practically worshipped. Jada had always made it her personal mission to remind me of my supposed inferiority. She flaunted her wealth, her status, and her perfect marriage to my brother at every opportunity. Whenever I visited, she would make snide comments about my sensible clothes, or ask why a woman of my age had not managed to secure a husband yet. She stood there in her custom designer gown, swirling her drink with absolute delight. Her eyes met mine, and her malicious smile broadened. She leaned over and whispered something to Cameron, and they both laughed. They were enjoying my public execution. "I gave you everything," my father yelled, taking an aggressive step closer to where I was kneeling on the floor. He leaned down, his face twisted in rage. "I paid for your food, I put a roof over your head, and I tolerated your worthless existence for 33 years. And this is how you repay me. By refusing a simple request to help your own flesh and blood. You live in a tiny apartment, you have no husband, you have no real assets, and you spend your days crunching numbers for other people's businesses. You are a nobody. We offered you a chance to be part of something bigger, to actually contribute to this family's legacy, and you spit in our faces." I remained on the floor, taking slow, measured breaths. I looked around the room at the faces in the crowd. These were people who claimed to be upstanding citizens, philanthropists, and community leaders. Yet they stood there holding their expensive drinks, watching a grown woman get assaulted by her own father, and they did absolutely nothing to intervene. Some looked away in discomfort, but others watched with morbid fascination. It was sickening. But in a strange way, their silence validated every single choice I had made over the last 6 months. It proved exactly what kind of world my family operated in, a world where money excused violence and status erased morality. I remembered all the holidays where I was seated at the far end of the table, ignored while my parents praised Cameron for his mediocre achievements. I remembered my mother telling her country club friends that I was just a glorified bookkeeper who struggled with basic math, completely erasing my actual career as a senior forensic accountant at a massive Wall Street investment firm. My family truly believed I was a struggling, desperate woman who needed their charity. They believed I was weak and easily manipulated. They had no idea that I was the predator and they were the prey. My father loomed over me, his chest heaving with exertion. "You are a disgrace to the Apex Freight name," he spat. "You are going to pick up that pen, you are going to sign that guarantee, and then you are going to get out of my sight before I call security to throw you into the street like the trash you are." The paper he was referring to lay on the floor a few feet away, right next to a pool of my spilled champagne. It was splattered with a few drops of my own blood. It was a personal guarantee for a $5 million short-term loan. A loan they desperately needed to cover up a massive financial hole before they finalized the $80 million sale of their company. They wanted to use my name, my credit, and my hypothetical future to absorb their toxic debt. I slowly wiped the blood from my chin with the back of my hand. The metallic taste in my mouth was sharp and my jaw throbbed with a dull, heavy ache, but my mind was completely clear. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not beg for mercy or try to explain myself to the silent crowd of cowards surrounding us. I simply pushed myself up to a kneeling position, ignoring the glass biting into my knees, and looked up at the man who had just struck me. "I am not signing," I said, my voice eerily calm and echoing clearly in the silent room. I looked him dead in the eye, letting a cold, knowing smile touch my bloody lips. "That piece of paper is a prison sentence." 10 minutes earlier, the atmosphere inside the exclusive VIP lounge of the Ritz-Carlton felt entirely different from the bustling party outside. The heavy mahogany doors had been shut tight, sealing out the jazz music and the cheerful chatter of the wealthy guests. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of my father's expensive Cuban cigars and the cloying scent of my brother Cameron's designer cologne. I sat at the edge of a massive glass conference table wearing a simple gray polyester dress I had bought off a clearance rack. I wore it specifically because they expected me to look like a struggling data entry clerk. I played the part perfectly, letting them underestimate me. Richard paced the length of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his face set in a hard, authoritative scowl. Cameron leaned against the leather sofa, swirling a glass of amber liquid, looking utterly pleased with himself. Jada stood next to him, her flawless dark skin glowing under the recessed lighting. She was draped in a custom emerald gown that cost more than my supposed annual salary, and brilliant diamonds glittered at her throat. She looked at me like I was a repulsive stain on the pristine carpet. My father stopped pacing and slapped a thick manila folder onto the glass table directly in front of me. He slid a heavy gold-plated pen right beside it. "Sign it, Allison," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for discussion or debate. "It is just a standard personal guarantee, a mere formality. We are finalizing the $80 million merger with Vanguard next week, and the corporate auditors need to see completely clean ledgers. We need a temporary $5 million bridge loan to balance some minor operational deficits. Since Cameron is stepping up as the new chief executive officer today, his name cannot be attached to any personal liabilities during the transition period. You will put your name on it. The company will pay it off the moment the merger funds clear, and you will be fine." I did not touch the pen. Instead, I opened the folder and slowly scanned the dense legal documents. To them, I was just a naive 33-year-old spinster who barely understood basic addition, let alone corporate finance. But my eyes were highly trained to spot financial anomalies from a mile away. I read the terms, the interest rates, and the specific routing instructions for the loan disbursement. The money was not going into the primary operational accounts of Apex Freight. It was being quietly routed through a series of newly established vendor accounts. I traced my finger over a highly specific indemnification clause on the second page. I looked up at my brother, letting the silence stretch for a moment. "Cameron," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "why exactly does a domestic logistics company need a $5 million bridge loan routed through an offshore consulting firm based in the Cayman Islands? Furthermore, this liability clause explicitly waives corporate indemnity. If the merger falls through, or if these funds somehow disappear, the bank will seize my personal assets immediately. I am not a board member. I have zero equity in Apex Freight. There is absolutely no logical business reason for me to underwrite this massive debt." Cameron let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He slammed his crystal glass down on a side table. "Listen to her, Dad?" Cameron sneered, pointing a finger at me. "She reads one legal paragraph and suddenly she thinks she is a Wall Street financial analyst. You do not need to understand the routing, Allison. You just need to pick up the pen and sign your name exactly where you are told. This is high-level corporate finance. It is way above your pay grade. Do not try to act smart because you are just embarrassing yourself." My father leaned heavily over the table, his massive frame casting a dark shadow over me. "We are giving you a rare chance to finally do something useful for this family." He growled, his eyes narrowing. "We paid for your food, your clothes, and your completely useless existence for decades. You live in a tiny rented box. You have nothing of value to lose anyway. Just sign the damn paper right now so we can go out there and celebrate your brother's massive success." I pushed the folder back toward him, refusing to break eye contact. "The cash flow statements do not align with your story," I said firmly. "Apex Freight reported record-breaking profits last quarter. If the company is as financially healthy as you claim to Vanguard, there should be zero operational deficit requiring a blind $5 million injection. You are actively covering up missing funds. You want me to be the convenient scapegoat when the federal regulators come knocking." The silence that followed my accusation was deafening. Richard turned a dangerous shade of purple. Cameron's smug, arrogant smile vanished completely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. But it was Jada who reacted first. She stepped forward, her high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She snatched her full glass of red Pinot Noir from the table. Without a single second of hesitation, she hurled the dark liquid straight at my chest. The wine splashed violently against my face and soaked into my cheap gray dress, blooming like a massive, bloody bruise across the fabric. The cold liquid dripped down my collar and stained my skin. "You ungrateful little rat!" Jada hissed, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. She stood over me, looking down her perfectly contoured nose. "You should be down on your knees thanking God that this family even gives you the chance to touch a piece of paper worth $5 million. Look at yourself, Allison. You are 33 years old. You have no husband. You have no property. You have absolutely no assets to your name. You are a complete and utter failure in every sense of the word." Jada leaned closer, her diamond necklace catching the light as she sneered viciously. "My husband is about to become a multi-million-dollar chief executive officer, while you are still playing the pathetic role of the tragic spinster. How long do you plan to leech off this family? You walk in here wearing those cheap rags, acting like you understand business. We are offering you a chance to prove your loyalty, and you dare to question us. You are a burden. You have always been a burden to everyone here. Sign the paper and stop begging for attention." I sat there feeling the cold wine dripping onto my lap. I looked at my father, who was watching the scene with total approval. I looked at Cameron, who was smiling again, relieved that his wife had put me in my place. They truly thought they had broken me. They thought I would cower, cry, and reach for the pen to seek their approval. I slowly stood up from the leather chair. I picked up the thick manila folder containing the $5 million guarantee. The heavy silence in the VIP room was palpable as they waited for my submission. Instead, I gripped the top of the binding. With one sharp, forceful motion, I ripped the entire stack of legal documents straight down the middle. The sound of tearing paper echoed loudly in the small room. My father's eyes widened in absolute shock. Jada gasped, taking a step back as the pieces fluttered to the floor like dead leaves. "I am not carrying the debt for your Birkin bags, Jada," I said. The sound of the tearing paper hung in the heavy air of the VIP lounge. It was a sound that sealed my fate with this family, but unlocked the cage I had lived in for decades. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. Then the reality of my defiance registered on my father's face. Richard did not just get angry. He erupted with a primal violent rage that completely shattered his carefully constructed image of a sophisticated corporate executive. His massive hands slammed down on the glass table, cracking the surface right down the center. Before I could even drop the torn halves of the $5 million guarantee to the floor, he lunged across the space between us. He moved with terrifying speed for a man his size. His heavy fingers dug fiercely into my scalp, twisting violently into the roots of my hair. The physical pain was instantaneous and blinding. A sharp gasp escaped my lips as the sudden brutal force snapped my head backward. "You stupid, ungrateful wretch," my father roared, his spit hitting my cheek. "You think you can walk into my company and disrespect me? You think you can destroy your brother's future with your petty jealousy?" He did not let go. Instead, he tightened his iron grip, twisting his fist deeper into my hair until tears automatically pricked the corners of my eyes. He yanked me forward, dragging me stumbling toward the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP lounge. My knees hit the hardwood floor, but he did not stop moving. He pulled me forcefully, making me scramble and slide across the polished surface just to keep my neck from snapping under his weight. Jada stepped aside, quickly protecting her custom emerald gown from my flailing limbs. She covered her mouth in feigned shock, but her dark eyes danced with absolute triumph. Cameron did not even flinch at the sight of his sister being assaulted. He simply picked up his crystal glass of scotch and followed us toward the exit, taking a slow, satisfied sip of his expensive drink. "Throw her out, Dad," Cameron sneered, his voice dripping with venomous amusement. "Losers do not belong here. She is polluting the air. We have an $80 million empire to celebrate tonight, and she is just a pathetic stain on our massive success." My father kicked the heavy double doors open with his polished leather shoe. The sudden burst of light from the grand ballroom was blinding. We spilled out from the private lounge directly into the center of the promotion party. The live jazz band abruptly stopped playing their instruments mid-note. The cheerful clinking of champagne glasses and the low hum of wealthy conversations died instantly. 75 of Chicago's most elite figures, including corporate partners, local politicians, and high society socialites, turned their heads simultaneously to witness the horrific spectacle. I felt the collective weight of their stares burning intensely into my skin. I was being dragged like a wild animal through the pristine hallways of the Ritz-Carlton, my gray dress stained heavily with dark red wine that looked exactly like fresh blood under the glowing crystal chandeliers. My shoes scraped uselessly against the expensive marble tiles. I tried to pry my father's thick fingers away from my aching scalp, but his grip was unrelenting. He paraded my total humiliation in front of the very people who were supposed to respect him. But in his blind rage, he did not care about optics anymore. He only cared about punishing my sudden disobedience. Not a single person stepped forward to intervene. The men in their tailored tuxedos simply took a step back, clearing a wide path for my father to drag me through the crowd. The women in their designer gowns whispered behind their manicured hands, averting their eyes, but making sure they did not miss a single second of the unfolding drama. They watched my physical destruction as if it were a scheduled performance for the evening entertainment. My father hauled me through the grand foyer toward the revolving glass doors at the front entrance of the hotel. The cold night air hit my face the moment the automatic sensors triggered the exit. He dragged me out onto the concrete landing of the valet parking area. The temperature outside was absolutely freezing, a bitter Chicago wind cutting straight through my thin, soaked dress. With one final violent heave, he threw me forward into the darkness. My hands flew out desperately to brace for the harsh impact. My palms slammed hard against the rough, freezing stone steps, tearing the delicate skin and sending a brutal shockwave of pain up my arms. My knees crashed against the unforgiving concrete, tearing the cheap fabric of my dress and deeply bruising the bone. I collapsed onto the cold ground, gasping for air, my chest heaving rapidly as the icy wind whipped my tangled hair across my stinging face. Richard stood at the top of the stone steps, looking down at me like I was a repulsive insect he had just crushed beneath his feet. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at my shivering body. "From this exact moment onward, I do not have a daughter like you," he bellowed, his harsh voice carrying across the empty parking lot and bouncing off the concrete walls. "You are dead to me, Allison. Do not ever show your face near my company or my family again. You are nothing. You will always be nothing." He turned his back on me, his broad shoulders heaving with heavy exertion. He marched back inside the warm, brightly lit hotel without a single ounce of hesitation. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind him with a definitive click, locking me out in the cold, dark night. The warmth, the music, the immense wealth, it was all sealed away behind that thick pane of glass. I lay there on the freezing stone, my breath forming white clouds in the frigid winter air. My scalp throbbed fiercely where clumps of hair had been violently ripped out. The spilled wine, soaked deep into my dress, was freezing against my bare skin, making my entire body shiver uncontrollably. I pushed myself up slowly, tasting the sharp metallic tang of blood from where my teeth had caught my lip during the heavy fall. I braced my torn hands against the concrete, preparing to stand up and walk away from this living nightmare once and for all. But before I could fully rise to my feet, the sharp, rhythmic click of designer high heels echoed loudly on the stone landing. Someone had followed me outside into the freezing cold. I looked up slowly through the tangled mess of my hair. It was not a security guard coming to chase me off the private property. It was my mother, Sylvia. She stood at the very top of the stairs, wrapped tightly in her luxurious mink coat, shivering slightly against the bitter breeze. She did not reach out her warm hand to help me up from the frozen ground. She did not ask if I was bleeding or if any bones were broken from the brutal throw. She simply stood there looking down at my broken state, with an expression of profound disappointment, perfectly preparing to deliver the final killing blow to my completely shattered heart. The biting Chicago wind howled viciously through the concrete parking structure, but my mother did not seem to feel the freezing cold. Sylvia stood perfectly still, wrapped tightly in her floor-length mink coat. The massive diamonds on her fingers caught the harsh artificial glare of the halogen street lamps above us. She looked down at me, bleeding and shivering on the frozen pavement with an expression completely devoid of any maternal instinct. There was no horror in her eyes at seeing her own flesh and blood battered and dragged by her husband. There was no desperate instinct to reach out her hand and pull me up from the ice. Instead, she looked at me with the exact same mild distaste she reserved for a scuffed pair of designer shoes or a waiter who had brought her the wrong vintage of expensive wine. She slowly unclasped her quilted Chanel handbag. The metallic click sounded incredibly loud in the quiet isolation of the valet loading zone. She reached her manicured fingers inside and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. She held the money out over me, holding it delicately between her perfectly painted fingernails. Then, with a deliberate opening of her hand, she let it drop. The green paper fluttered slowly through the freezing air and landed directly beside my bleeding knee. It was the ultimate insult, packaged neatly as a gesture of charity. My mother crossed her arms over her luxurious fur coat and let out a long, exasperated sigh that I had heard 1,000 times before. "You have always been exactly like this, Allison," she said, her tone dripping with manufactured disappointment rather than genuine anger. "Since you were a teenager in high school, you have made it your absolute mission to ruin every single one of Cameron's achievements. You could never stand the fact that he was destined for greatness while you were meant to stay in the background. Do you remember when he won the state debate championship? and you just had to point out that his final argument was plagiarized. Or when he started his first logistics branch and you refused to do the bookkeeping for free. You have always been a bitter, jealous saboteur trying to drag your own brother down into the mud with you. I knelt there on the concrete, letting her venomous words wash over me. This was her ultimate specialty. Sylvia was a master manipulator who could twist any narrative until the victim felt like the villain. She had spent my entire life convincing me that my boundaries were acts of aggression and that my independence was a personal attack on the family legacy. Now she was doing it again right after my father had physically assaulted me in public. Look at Jada, she continued, gesturing back toward the glowing glass doors of the hotel where the promotion party raged on without us. Cannot you see how absolutely perfect your sister-in-law is? Jada understands exactly what it takes to build a corporate empire. She brings vital political connections to this family from the South Side. She brings prestige, elegance, and undeniable status to the Apex Freight name. When Jada walks into a room, people respect us instantly. But you, Allison, you only bring us profound shame. You showed up tonight wearing a cheap clearance rack dress looking like a desperate street beggar just to cause a massive scene. You are 33 years old. You have no husband to provide for you. You have no social standing. You refuse to support your own blood. You are a complete embarrassment to everything your father and I have built over the last 4 decades. The freezing wind whipped my tangled hair across my face, but I did not break eye contact with her. She looked down her nose at me, her expression hardening into absolute disgust. I am done trying to defend your pathetic behavior to your father, she stated coldly, crossing her arms tighter against the bitter winter chill. I am done pretending that you are a part of this prestigious family. We gave you an incredible opportunity to be useful tonight, and you threw it back in our faces in the most disrespectful way possible. Pick up that money from the ground. Take a cheap taxi back to whatever miserable slum apartment you are renting right now. Do not call my phone. Do not text your brother. And absolutely do not ever show your face at the Apex Freight corporate offices again. You are entirely on your own now. You chose this path of isolation and failure, so now you get to live with the harsh consequences. Sylvia expected me to break. She stood there waiting patiently for the familiar reaction she had conditioned out of me for 3 decades. She expected the hot tears to well up in my eyes. She expected me to reach out with trembling hands and beg for her forgiveness. She expected me to snatch that crumpled $100 bill from the freezing concrete and sob pathetic apologies into the night air. But the tears never came. The frightened little girl who used to crave her mother's conditional love had died on the floor of that VIP lounge the moment my father tore the hair from my scalp. I placed my scraped palms flat against the freezing stone and slowly pushed myself upright. My joints ached fiercely, and my torn dress clung to my bruised skin, but I stood up to my full height, squaring my shoulders against the cold. I reached up with a remarkably steady hand and smoothed my tangled, bloody hair back from my face. I looked down at the $100 bill resting on the icy pavement. Without a single word, I stepped forward, bringing the sharp stiletto heel of my shoe down directly onto the center of the crisp green paper, pinning it firmly against the concrete. I tilted my head slightly and looked straight into my mother's eyes. I did not scream or argue. Instead, I let a slow, freezing, dead-eyed smile spread across my bloody lips. It was a smile completely devoid of any warmth or humanity. It was the smile of an apex predator who had just locked the cage from the outside. Sylvia stopped breathing. The color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face. For the first time in my entire life, I watched my mother shudder uncontrollably and take a terrified, stumbling step backward. I turned my back on my mother and walked away. The sound of her sharp intake of breath was the only response I needed. My cheap heels clicked steadily against the freezing concrete of the parking garage as I moved deeper into the dimly lit structure. The bitter wind continued to bite through the thin fabric of my ruined gray dress, but I barely registered the cold anymore. My entire body hummed with a dangerous electric energy. I navigated through rows of gleaming Mercedes and sleek black town cars until I reached my vehicle parked in the very last row. It was a battered 10-year-old Honda Civic with peeling paint and a dented bumper. To my family, this car was the ultimate symbol of my pathetic existence. To me, it was the perfect camouflage. I unlocked the door and slid into the freezing driver's seat. The stale smell of old coffee and cheap vanilla air freshener greeted me. I reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror. The reflection staring back at me was a mess. My lip was split and swelling rapidly. A thin stream of dark blood had traced a path from my scalp down the side of my forehead, drying into a sticky crust near my jawline. My hair was tangled and wild. I looked exactly like the broken, defeated woman my father and brother wanted me to be. But the eyes in the mirror were completely devoid of fear. They were calculating, sharp, and utterly lethal. I reached into the passenger seat and unzipped my battered canvas tote bag. I pushed aside the fake grocery receipts and old magazines I used as props and pulled out a heavy military-grade encrypted laptop. It was a matte black machine that cost more than the Honda Civic I was sitting in. I flipped the screen open. A blinding white light illuminated the dark interior of the car. A biometric scanner flashed red, requiring my thumbprint. I pressed my thumb against the sensor. The screen immediately shifted to a complex dark mode dashboard filled with scrolling lines of code and high-security firewalls. I am not a lowly data entry clerk. I am not a struggling spinster who begs for scraps from her wealthy family. My name is Allison, and I am the lead senior forensic accountant for the Vanguard Investment Group on Wall Street. In the corporate intelligence world, my code name is Hawkeye. I specialize in tearing apart fraudulent empires and exposing white-collar criminals who think they are untouchable. 6 months ago, Vanguard initiated talks to acquire my father's logistics company Apex Freight for a staggering $80 million. The initial financial reports provided by my brother Cameron looked absolutely flawless. They were too flawless. My boss Silas recognized the artificial perfection of the ledgers and suspected foul play. He needed someone on the inside. He needed someone who could access the physical servers, bypass the corporate firewalls, and dig into the actual cash flow without raising a single red flag. So I volunteered. I weaponized my own family's disdain for me. I knew my father and brother viewed me as a pathetic failure, so I played the part to absolute perfection. I rented a tiny apartment. I drove this terrible car. I wore clearance rack clothes and accepted their constant verbal abuse with my head bowed. My perceived weakness gave me unprecedented access. Because they thought I was stupid, they never bothered to hide their digital footprints when I was in the building. They handed me the keys to their own destruction simply because they believed I was too incompetent to understand what I was looking at. My fingers flew across the keyboard with rapid precision. I bypassed the final security layer and accessed the Vanguard secure servers linking the data I had extracted tonight from the VIP lounge directly into the mainframe. The screen exploded into a massive web of financial charts, offshore routing numbers, and encrypted wire transfers. I watched the green and red graphs reflect against the windshield as I began to unravel the massive web of deceit Richard and Cameron had built. The $5 million personal guarantee they tried to force me to sign tonight was not a bridge loan for operational deficits. I pulled up the routing code I had memorized from the manila folder before my father dragged me out. I traced the alphanumeric sequence through 3 different proxy servers. The money was designed to bounce through a shell corporation in Delaware before being wired directly to a holding account in the Cayman Islands. I opened another window and cross-referenced the Cayman account with the Apex Freight Employee Pension Fund. The truth materialized on the screen in glaring red numbers. Richard and Cameron had not just been cooking the books to inflate the company valuation for the Vanguard merger. They had been actively draining the retirement accounts of their own truck drivers and warehouse workers for the past 7 years. They used a sophisticated double bookkeeping method to hide the massive hemorrhaging of cash. The fake bridge loan tonight was meant to momentarily plug the gap so the Vanguard auditors would not notice the missing capital during the final acquisition sweep. If I had signed that paper tonight, I would have become the sole legal guarantor of a ghost loan. When the federal regulators inevitably discovered the missing pension funds, Richard and Cameron would have pointed the finger directly at me. They would have claimed the erratic, estranged daughter embezzled the money and fled. They were fully prepared to send their own flesh and blood to federal prison just to protect their $80 million payday. I watched the progress bar on my screen surge forward as my custom algorithm finished compiling the final forensic report. It matched every single fraudulent transaction to the corresponding offshore account. It tied the embezzled funds directly to the luxury real estate and the designer jewelry my brother and his wife flaunted so proudly. The progress bar hit 100% with a soft chime. The final total flashed onto the center of the screen in bold, undeniable digits. $15 million. They had stolen $15 million from their own employees and attempted to commit massive federal wire fraud against one of the largest investment firms on Wall Street. The evidence was absolute. The digital trail was airtight. There was no escaping this. I reached into the center console of the freezing car and picked up my encrypted smartphone. I wiped a stray drop of blood from my chin. It was time to end the play. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner of my encrypted satellite phone. The screen illuminated the dark cabin of my battered Honda Civic, casting a harsh blue glow over my bruised face and blood-stained dress. The heating system in the old car rattled uselessly against the freezing Chicago winter, but the cold no longer bothered me. My pulse was steady. My mind was a steel trap. The phone beeped twice, indicating a secure connection bypassing standard cell towers and routing directly through Vanguard corporate intelligence servers. The line connected with a soft electronic click. There was no ringing. There was no formal greeting. The man on the other end of the line did not need caller identification to know who was reaching out at this hour on this specific encrypted frequency. "Is everything done, Hawkeye?" The voice of Silas, the chairman of the board at Vanguard Investment Group, resonated through the small speaker. His tone was smooth, controlled, and utterly devoid of panic. Silas was a man who moved billions of dollars across global markets before breakfast. He did not deal in emotions. He dealt in absolute certainties and undeniable facts. That was exactly why he had personally recruited me for this undercover operation 6 months ago. He knew my familial connection to Apex Freight would either be my greatest weakness or my sharpest weapon. I just proved it was the latter. I reached up and wiped a fresh drop of blood from my chin, smearing it across the back of my bruised hand. I stared at the red stain for a split second before answering. "Apex Freight is a burning building, Silas," I said, my voice echoing with a chilling clarity inside the freezing vehicle. "Their official financial report is nothing but absolute trash. The numbers they submitted for the $80 million merger evaluation are completely fabricated from top to bottom. They are running a sophisticated double bookkeeping scheme that dates back at least 7 years. I have traced massive tax evasion, corporate money laundering, and a network of ghost entities. They set up 4 primary shell companies, all registered under offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands." I kept my eyes locked on the glowing laptop screen in the passenger seat where the digital evidence was securely compiling into impenetrable legal files. They have been systematically draining their own employee pension funds and hiding the massive deficit. I continued. "Tonight, they tried to force me to sign a $5 million personal guarantee disguised as a short-term bridge loan. It was a trap. They needed a sacrificial lamb to absorb the toxic debt before the Vanguard auditors finalized the acquisition sweep. They intended to let me take the fall and face federal prison while they walked away with our $80 million payout. They truly believed I was stupid enough to just sign my life away and carry the burden for their designer lifestyles." A low, dark chuckle came through the encrypted line. Silas was not laughing at the fraud. He was laughing at the sheer monumental arrogance of Richard and Cameron. They actually thought they could outsmart the lead forensic accountant of Wall Street. Silas murmured, his voice laced with dangerous amusement. They thought they were playing a simple game of checkers, while you were silently rearranging the entire chessboard right under their noses. Do you have the raw data secured, Allison? Are we ready to move forward with the final phase of this operation? I have every single byte of data secured, I replied firmly. I have intercepted their offshore routing codes, their unauthorized wire transfers, and the internal corporate communications proving malicious intent. I have gathered enough concrete evidence to lock the entire executive board of Apex Freight behind bars for the next 2 decades. The digital trail is absolutely flawless, and it is currently uploading directly to your private secure server. You need to inform Agent Thorne of the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. Tell the White Collar Crime Division that the target is fully compromised. The bait has been swallowed whole. The silence on the line was brief but heavy with anticipation. The gears of a massive corporate takedown were already turning rapidly in Silas' mind. I could practically hear him mobilizing his elite legal team and coordinating with federal law enforcement agents to prepare the final documentation. Tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock, they are hosting the final merger signing ceremony at our corporate headquarters, I stated, my voice dropping to a deadly serious whisper that filled the cold car. Richard and Cameron will walk into that grand room believing they have successfully hidden a $15 million embezzlement scheme from the world. They will arrive in their tailored suits expecting to drink expensive champagne, shake hands with our executives, and sign the final acquisition papers that will cement their fraudulent wealth. They truly think they have won this dangerous game. Tomorrow at the signing ceremony, we will close the heavy iron net around them permanently. Silas let out a deep breath of absolute satisfaction. Excellent, he replied, his tone vibrating with unyielding authority and undeniable power. I will make the call to Agent Thorne right now so they can prepare the arrest warrants. The federal agents will be waiting in the wings, ready to strike the moment the ink dries on those fake contracts. But the final blow belongs entirely to you, Allison. Tomorrow morning you will drop the pathetic disguise you have worn for half a year. You will no longer be the invisible accountant they treated like absolute garbage. Tomorrow you will represent Vanguard, and you will step proudly into that meeting room as the lead executive on this historic acquisition. Let them see exactly who they just messed with, and let them watch their entire empire burn. The encrypted line clicked off. I sat alone in the freezing dark, smiling. The trap was set, and my predators were about to become the ultimate helpless prey. At exactly 9 in the morning, the golden sunlight of Manhattan poured heavily through the floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass windows of the Vanguard Financial Tower. The 50th floor boardroom was an absolute masterpiece of corporate intimidation and modern luxury. A massive, polished obsidian table dominated the center of the spacious room, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs that cost more than what most average people earned in a year. The panoramic view of the New York skyline spread out beneath them like a conquered kingdom. Richard, Cameron, Jada, and Sylvia stood proudly near the edge of the glass, holding crystal flutes filled with complimentary vintage Dom Perignon. They looked and acted like absolute royalty, arriving to collect their rightful crown. Richard wore a bespoke Italian suit that perfectly hid the violent exertion and unhinged rage he had displayed the previous night. His posture was completely straight, his chest puffed out with the supreme arrogance of a man who believed he was mere minutes away from pocketing $80 million. Sylvia stood right beside him, draped elegantly in a pristine white cashmere coat. She looked entirely unbothered by the indisputable fact that she had left her bleeding, injured daughter on the freezing concrete just hours ago. Her makeup was entirely flawless, her demeanor sickeningly serene. She sipped her expensive champagne with the calm detachment of a sociopath who had successfully eliminated a minor inconvenience from her perfect life. Cameron paced the length of the immaculate boardroom, taking long, greedy sips of his drink. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and checked his solid gold Rolex, grinning wildly at his own reflection in the towering glass panes. Today was the day he officially stepped out of his father's shadow and became the multi-millionaire chief executive officer of a newly acquired corporate empire. Jada was practically vibrating with toxic excitement as she trailed behind her husband. She wore a tailored crimson designer dress that hugged her figure perfectly, pairing it with a brand new diamond necklace that she had undoubtedly purchased using the stolen employee pension funds they were currently hiding. They clinked their crystal glasses together, the sharp ringing sound echoing through the cavernous boardroom. They were prematurely celebrating a massive victory they had not yet officially secured, completely blind to the invisible iron noose that was rapidly tightening around their necks. The conversation among the four of them naturally drifted toward the violent spectacle of the previous night. Richard let out a loud, booming laugh as he recalled dragging his own flesh and blood across the hotel lobby in front of his wealthy peers. He took a heavy sip of his drink and shook his head in mock pity. I guarantee you Allison is sitting in her pathetic little studio apartment right now crying her eyes out, he boasted, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. She probably spent the entire night shaking in that rusted piece of junk she calls a car, realizing she just threw away the only family that ever tolerated her. She will come crawling back to us. They always come crawling back when they realize they have absolutely nothing else and no one who cares about them. Sylvia sighed softly, taking another delicate sip of her champagne before smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her expensive skirt. I honestly tried to help her. Sylvia lied, her voice laced with that sickeningly sweet, manipulative tone she had perfected over decades of gaslighting. I even gave her $100 bill to get a taxi home. But some people simply choose to be miserable. She has always been so deeply ungrateful and so determined to play the victim. It is honestly a massive relief that we do not have to pretend to care about her dreary little life anymore. Now we can finally focus entirely on the people who actually elevate this family name and bring us real prestige. Cameron chuckled darkly, setting his empty glass down on the obsidian table. He leaned heavily against the expensive leather chair, crossing his arms with a look of pure malice. Did you see the look of sheer panic on her face when Dad threw her out onto the pavement? Cameron mocked, his eyes gleaming with vicious joy. She actually thought she held some sort of power over us because she read one legal clause in a contract she could not even comprehend. She is just a glorified human calculator. A miserable, lonely spinster who cannot stand the fact that we are moving up to the billionaire class, while she is permanently stuck eating discount ramen in the slums. Jada stepped closer to her husband, raising her left hand to admire the morning light catching on the facets of her massive new diamond ring. She stroked the sparkling stone with her thumb, a wicked, satisfied smirk stretching across her perfectly painted lips. I told you, Jada purred, her voice echoing sharply in the quiet boardroom. That little brat is just jealous of our status. She looks at my life, at our marriage, at the political power my family holds in this city, and it eats her alive from the inside out. She wanted to ruin your promotion last night because she knows she will never in a million years achieve a fraction of what we have built. Let her rot in her miserable little world. Today we secure the ultimate bag and we leave her in the dust permanently. The four of them raised their crystal flutes high into the air, proposing a final joyous toast to their own brilliant deception and their impending massive wealth. The sound of their self-congratulatory laughter filled the opulent room. They firmly believed they were the smartest people in the entire financial district. They believed they had successfully buried a $15 million embezzlement scheme without leaving a single trace, and successfully discarded the only person who had dared to stand in their way. But their arrogant celebration was abruptly cut short. The heavy mahogany double doors of the boardroom swung open with a smooth, silent glide. A sharply dressed executive assistant holding a silver digital tablet stepped professionally into the room. Her expression was completely neutral, her posture rigid with strict corporate discipline. Richard quickly set his glass down, plastering on his most charming business smile, expecting to see the Vanguard acquisition team ready to hand over the final checks. Instead, the assistant stood tall and looked directly at the four of them, her voice cutting through the thick air of the boardroom with chilling precision. "Ladies and gentlemen," the assistant announced clearly, Our head of forensic accounting will personally come in to approve and sign off on this $80 million merger file right now. The assistant stepped back smoothly, allowing the heavy mahogany double doors of the boardroom to swing fully open. The rhythmic clicking of my sharp stiletto heels echoed against the polished marble floor of the corridor outside, growing steadily louder and more deliberate with every passing second. Inside the opulent room, the suffocating arrogance of my family hung thickly in the air, but it was about to be completely decimated. I walked through the doorway, letting the sheer magnitude of my presence flood the space. The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantaneously, chilling the warm morning air. The bright sunlight streaming through the panoramic windows caught my silhouette, casting a long, dominant shadow across the polished obsidian table where my father had been leaning just moments before. The joyful atmosphere of their premature celebration shattered instantly, replaced by a sudden heavy and deeply uncomfortable silence that swallowed their previous laughter. I was no longer the pathetic, frightened spinster they had dragged across a hotel lobby like a piece of garbage. I was no longer wearing the cheap clearance rack dress heavily stained with red wine and my own blood. Today I wore a bespoke charcoal gray Tom Ford suit, tailored to absolute perfection to command immediate respect. The sharp, structured angles of the blazer accentuated my upright posture, while the crisp white silk shirt underneath spoke of quiet, undeniable wealth and authority. A platinum Cartier watch gleamed on my wrist, catching the sunlight with every calculated movement. The tangled mess of hair my father had violently ripped from my scalp last night was now pulled back into a sleek, severe chignon. A top-tier makeup artist had worked meticulously that morning to conceal the dark purple bruising along my jawline and the nasty gash on my forehead. My skin looked completely flawless, but my eyes were cold, calculating, and sharp as razors. I stared directly at my family, letting them absorb the terrifying reality of my massive physical and professional transformation. I did not walk into that 50-story financial fortress alone. Flanking my right side was Silas, the chairman of the board at Vanguard Investment Group and one of the most feared corporate titans on Wall Street. Silas wore a custom navy pinstripe suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his expression radiating lethal, unyielding authority. He did not walk ahead of me. He walked slightly behind my right shoulder, a subtle but incredibly powerful corporate gesture demonstrating to everyone in the room that I was the one holding the absolute authority today. Behind us marched a formidable phalanx of Vanguard's elite corporate attorneys and senior compliance officers. 6 men and women carrying thick leather briefcases and glowing digital tablets filled with irrefutable evidence of the Apex Freight embezzlement scheme. They moved in perfect unison, a silent army of financial executioners ready to dismantle a fraudulent empire brick by brick. We entered the room not as business partners, but as an absolute conquering force arriving to deliver a devastating verdict. The reaction from my family was a masterpiece of unfolding horror. The arrogant smirks literally melted off their faces, replaced by a raw, visceral shock that paralyzed their limbs. Jada was the first to process the visual anomaly. Her hand began to tremble so violently that the expensive vintage champagne spilled over the rim of her crystal flute and splashed onto her crimson designer dress, exactly mirroring the wine she had maliciously thrown at me 12 hours earlier. She gasped loudly, taking a clumsy step backward until her high heels hit the thick glass window. Her eyes darted frantically from my designer suit to the intimidating wall of lawyers standing behind me. Cameron stared at me with his mouth hanging wide open, his brain completely short-circuiting as he tried to reconcile the powerful executive standing before him with the helpless sister he had mocked in the parking lot. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head side to side, as if trying to physically dislodge a vivid hallucination. The crystal glass of scotch he was holding slipped slightly in his sweaty palm, threatening to crash to the floor. Sylvia looked as though the air had been violently sucked directly from her lungs. The woman who had thrown a crisp $100 bill at me in an act of supreme condescension now clutched her cashmere coat tightly against her chest, as if seeking physical protection from the shifting reality. Her eyes darted wildly between my tailored Tom Ford suit and the imposing presence of Silas. She recognized the chairman from prominent financial magazines and elite society galas she so desperately wished to attend. Seeing her discarded daughter standing shoulder to shoulder with a billionaire titan of industry fundamentally broke her carefully constructed worldview. The vibrant color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking pale, sickly, and suddenly very old under the harsh fluorescent lights. She took a ragged breath, unable to form a single coherent word, her illusion of absolute superiority collapsing into fine dust. But it was Richard who reacted exactly as I knew he would. My father had spent 4 decades ruling his logistics company and his family through severe intimidation, physical violence, and absolute control. His rigid brain simply could not process a scenario where he was not the supreme uncontested authority in the room. He could not comprehend that the woman he had brutally assaulted and thrown onto the freezing concrete was now commanding an army of Wall Street lawyers in the very building where he expected to receive his $80 million payout. The initial shock mutated instantly into a blind, desperate rage. His face turned a deep, alarming shade of crimson, the thick veins in his neck bulging dangerously against his tight collar. Richard slammed his heavy fists down onto the obsidian boardroom table with a deafening crack that made Jada flinch violently and drop her glass, entirely shattering it across the expensive carpet. He pushed his massive frame forward completely, ignoring the presence of the Vanguard chairman and the elite legal team standing silently behind me. "What the hell are you doing here?" he roared, his voice echoing violently off the thick soundproof glass walls. He pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at my face, completely losing whatever shred of corporate composure he had managed to maintain for this morning meeting. "Security. Where is the damn security? Drag this crazy woman out of my sight right now." Silas did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply raised one hand. A single subtle gesture from the chairman of Vanguard Investment Group was enough to freeze the air in the room. The 2 broad-shouldered security guards who had instinctively stepped forward at Richards, shouting, immediately stopped dead in their tracks, seeing Silas command the space. Silas stepped out from behind my right shoulder and moved to stand directly in front of my father. The height difference was negligible, but the disparity in actual power was monumental. "Richard, you will hold your tongue, and you will show absolute respect to Miss Allison." Silas' voice was frigid, a perfectly modulated instrument of corporate execution that sliced through my father's blustering rage like a surgical scalpel. "She is the lead forensic examiner for this entire acquisition. She is the one who holds the absolute authority to decide the fate of this $80 million contract." Silas stepped 1 inch closer, forcing my father to instinctively lean back. "If you ever refer to my lead executive as a crazy woman again, I will terminate this merger agreement immediately. I will walk out of this building and I will ensure that Vanguard permanently blacklists your logistics company from every financial institution on Wall Street. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that occurs right after a fatal car crash. My father's mouth opened and closed silently, resembling a suffocating fish pulled violently from the water. The booming, tyrannical patriarch who had terrorized his household for decades was suddenly reduced to a trembling, voiceless old man. The thick veins on his neck flattened out as the blood drained entirely from his face, turning his complexion a sickly shade of gray. He looked frantically at the team of elite lawyers standing behind me, desperately searching their impassive faces for some sign that this was an elaborate prank. There was no amusement to be found in their eyes, only the cold, calculating stare of corporate predators ready to strike. Richard was finally realizing that his power meant absolutely nothing in this room. He was a small-town bully who had just walked blindly into a den of wolves. Across the room, Jada stood paralyzed against the thick, soundproof glass. Her jaw had dropped completely open, destroying her carefully curated expression of superiority. The remaining vintage champagne in her crystal flute trembled violently as her hand shook completely out of her control. The golden liquid splashed over the rim, soaking further into her expensive crimson dress, but she did not even blink to acknowledge the stain. She was finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of her fatal mistake. The woman she had degraded and humiliated, the woman she had viciously thrown wine at last night, was now the sole executioner holding the sharpest axe over her luxurious lifestyle. The political connections she bragged about were utterly useless against the crushing weight of Wall Street capital. Beside her, Sylvia looked as though her knees were about to give out entirely. My mother clutched the edge of the obsidian boardroom table, her knuckles turning stark white as she fought to keep her balance. Her eyes darted wildly toward me, begging for some flicker of familial recognition, some hint of the submissive, obedient daughter she had discarded on the freezing pavement. She was searching for a weakness she could exploit, a crack in my armor she could manipulate with her usual toxic guilt trips. I gave her absolutely nothing. My face remained a flawless mask of carved ice. I watched her world crumble, and I felt nothing but supreme satisfaction. And then there was Cameron. The newly minted chief executive officer of Apex Freight looked like a terrified child wearing his father's oversized suit. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly against his tightly knotted silk collar. The supreme arrogance he had displayed in the parking lot, the cruel laughter he had shared with our father while I bled on the concrete, had completely evaporated. He was staring at the heavy leather briefcases held by the Vanguard compliance officers, his mind slowly calculating the sheer volume of financial data they must contain. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him with the unstoppable force of a freight train. He was completely out of his depth, facing a financial titan he could not charm, manipulate, or bully. He knew deep down that his fabricated ledgers could not survive a genuine audit, and the woman leading that audit was the sister he had mercilessly abused. I did not wait for my father to formulate a pathetic apology. I did not give them a single second to recover from the massive psychological blow Silas had just delivered. I stepped forward, my expensive stiletto heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor, breaking the paralyzing silence. The Vanguard legal team parted seamlessly to let me through, moving with the precise coordination of a highly trained military unit. I walked the entire length of the massive obsidian table, owning every square inch of the room. I did not look at my mother. I did not look at Jada. I walked straight past my father, brushing my tailored shoulder against his stiff, paralyzed arm, intentionally invading his space to assert my dominance. I reached the head of the table, the seat of absolute authority. The chair was heavily padded black leather, designed specifically for the person who controlled the room and commanded the capital. I reached out and pulled the heavy chair back, the wheels gliding smoothly over the plush carpet. I smoothed the skirt of my Tom Ford suit and sat down with deliberate, measured grace. I leaned back into the leather, letting the sheer weight of my new reality settle over the room, pressing down on their chests. I placed my elbows on the cool, polished surface of the obsidian table and slowly interlaced my fingers. I let my eyes sweep across the terrified faces of my abusers, letting the tension build until the silence became physically painful for them. Finally, my gaze locked onto my brother, pinning him to his spot like a butterfly on a display board. "Sit down, Mr. Chief Executive Officer Cameron," I commanded, my voice echoing with total undisputed authority. "We have a lot of numbers to talk about." Cameron moved like a malfunctioning animatronic figure. He pulled out the heavy leather chair opposite mine and collapsed into it, his knees completely giving out beneath the weight of his own sudden terror. Richard and Sylvia scrambled to take the seats next to him, their movements jerky and stripped of all their previous country club arrogance. Jada remained standing against the thick glass wall for a long moment, her chest heaving rapidly, before my lead compliance officer simply pointed a stern finger at an empty chair. The silent command forced her to walk the humiliating walk of shame and sit down alongside her unraveling family. The air in the room was so thick with tension, it felt hard to breathe. They were staring at the sleek silver remote control in my hand as if it were a loaded weapon ready to detonate, I pressed a single button on the remote. The heavy motorized blackout blinds slowly descended over the panoramic windows, blocking out the bright morning sun and casting the opulent 50-story boardroom into sudden dramatic darkness. A massive high-definition projector hummed to life from the ceiling, casting a stark, blindingly bright rectangle onto the white wall directly behind me. They expected to see the $80 million merger contract displayed in all its glory. They fully expected to see the final signature pages that would secure their golden parachutes, validate their lifetime of corporate greed, and elevate them to the highest echelon of Chicago high society. Instead, the enormous screen illuminated with a highly classified offshore banking dashboard. 4 distinct corporate logos appeared on the projection alongside incredibly complex flowcharts, routing massive sums of capital across international borders. I picked up a thick, heavy stack of printed financial records from the table and slammed them down onto the obsidian glass. The loud, violent smack made my mother flinch so fiercely her shoulder slammed into Richard's arm. "These are the pristine ledgers you submitted to Vanguard for the acquisition audit," I stated, my voice cutting through the dark room with absolute lethal precision. "They paint a beautiful, flawless picture of a thriving logistics company ready for a massive Wall Street buyout. But forensic accounting is not about admiring the beautiful picture you painted to fool the public. It is about taking a scalpel and scraping off the thick layers of paint to expose the severe structural rot hidden underneath." I clicked the remote again. The screen zoomed in aggressively on the 4 corporate entities, bypassing the legal jargon and highlighting their operational statuses. "Let us discuss the rot," I continued, pacing slowly behind my chair. "Horizon Logistics, Apex Global Consulting, Summit Freight Ventures, and Pinnacle Management Solutions. 4 extremely active financial entities, completely absent from your official corporate disclosures." Jada let out a sharp, choking sound, as if she had swallowed a piece of broken glass. The warm, brown color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking ashen and severely ill as she stared at the massive screen. I turned my gaze directly to her, letting the full weight of my investigation pin her to the expensive leather chair. "Do these company names look familiar to you, Jada?" I asked, my tone echoing with cold professional mockery. "They absolutely should. I pulled the corporate registration filings directly from the Cayman Islands financial database last night while you were busy celebrating my physical assault. All 4 of these offshore shell companies are registered under your maiden name." Richard gripped the edge of the obsidian table, his knuckles turning stark white as he tried to salvage his collapsing empire. "Allison," he growled, his voice a desperate, pathetic mix of his usual fury and his newly discovered terror. "You do not understand what you are looking at on that screen. This is highly classified corporate structuring designed for tax efficiency. You have absolutely no legal right to access these private administrative files." I did not even blink at his weak attempt at intimidation. "I have every single right granted by federal oversight regulations and the Vanguard due diligence mandate," I fired back, shutting him down instantly. "You handed me the keys to your entire fraudulent kingdom when you thought I was too stupid and too insignificant to understand the locks." I pressed the remote again. Thick red lines began to animate on the screen, connecting the 4 shell companies directly to the primary operating accounts of Apex Freight. A digital avalanche of unauthorized wire transfers flooded the projection screen. Millions of dollars moving in the dead of night, deliberately hidden behind complex layers of encrypted proxy servers and fake vendor invoices. Cameron suddenly slammed his sweaty hand on the table, trying desperately to summon his newly appointed executive authority in front of the silent, watching Vanguard lawyers. "That is legitimate corporate maneuvering," he shouted, his voice cracking humiliatingly in the middle of his sentence. "It is a strategic investment initiative. We were diversifying our financial portfolio to protect the company assets before the merger went through. It is standard executive procedure for a buyout of this magnitude. You are just twisting the raw data to make us look bad because you are holding a petty grudge about what happened at the hotel last night." I looked at my brother with a level of profound disgust that could freeze boiling water. I let his pathetic, flimsy lie hang in the heavy air for a long, agonizing moment, allowing Silas and the entire elite legal team to fully absorb the sheer magnitude of his staggering incompetence. A strategic investment initiative, I repeated, my tone dripping with lethal, venomous mockery. I clicked the remote one final time. The massive screen shifted violently away from the complex flowcharts and zoomed directly into a highly specific itemized transaction log pulled straight from the Cayman accounts. The numbers glowed in bright, damning red letters that reflected in the terrified eyes of my family members. Strategic investment. Cameron, I asked, raising an eyebrow. Are you absolutely sure about that specific financial terminology? I stood up from my chair, leaning forward over the cold obsidian table, bridging the gap between my absolute power and their incoming destruction. $12 million systematically and maliciously pulled directly out of the Apex Freight Employee Pension Fund. I stated, my voice rising to deliver the final killing blow. $12 million stolen from the retirement accounts of your own loyal truck drivers and hard-working warehouse workers. And this brilliant strategic investment was used to purchase a luxury ski villa in Aspen and 5 custom Hermes bags for your wife Jada. The projection screen bathed Jada in a harsh crimson light, highlighting the sheer panic contorting her perfectly structured face. The undeniable photographic evidence of her luxury Aspen ski villa and the itemized receipts for her custom Hermes handbags sat right next to the stolen employee pension funds. For a fraction of a second, she looked exactly like a cornered animal, realizing the steel trap had snapped shut. But Jada was raised in the ruthless political arenas of the Chicago South Side. She had been taught from birth that aggressive denial and relentless intimidation were the only acceptable responses to being caught red-handed. She slammed her hands flat against the thick, soundproof glass wall behind her, pushing herself upright and desperately trying to summon the arrogant superiority she had wielded like a physical weapon just last night. Her voice shook violently, but she forced it to maximum volume, echoing harshly across the silent obsidian boardroom. "Do not you dare frame me with these fabricated numbers, Allison!" Jada shrieked, her eyes wide and wild with desperation. "You are deliberately altering corporate data to enact some sick, pathetic revenge fantasy because you are a miserable spinster. My family holds immense political power in this city. My father has judges and district attorneys on speed dial. If you think for one single second that the Chicago elite will let a bitter nobody drag our pristine family name through the mud, you are completely out of your mind. I will bury you in defamation lawsuits until you are entirely bankrupt. I will make sure you never work in the financial sector again." I stood completely motionless, watching her desperate theatrical performance unfold before the silent Vanguard executives. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic screaming. I did not blink or show a single ounce of intimidation. I simply lifted the sleek silver remote control and pressed a single button. The massive projection screen behind me went entirely black. The sudden darkness in the room was immediately filled with the crisp, high-fidelity sound of an audio recording echoing through the hidden surround sound speakers of the Vanguard boardroom. It was a highly classified digital file I had extracted directly from the heavily encrypted internal server of Apex Freight late last night while they were busy celebrating my physical assault. The voice that filled the room was unmistakably Jada. It was her arrogant, demanding tone laced with absolute, undeniable entitlement. "Listen to me carefully, Marcus," Jada's recorded voice ordered, addressing the former chief accountant of Apex Freight. "I do not care how you code the operational deficit. Just take the $3 million from the driver retirement pool and route it through the Pinnacle Management Solutions account in the Caymans. Code it as a strategic consulting expense. Cameron is stepping up as chief executive officer today, and he already approved the transfer. I need that capital cleared by Friday so the closing agent in Aspen can finalize the deed on the villa. Make it happen, or I will make sure you are fired before the Vanguard merger closes." The audio clip ended with a sharp digital click, returning the 50-story boardroom to a suffocating, deathly silence. The Vanguard compliance officers standing behind me did not even flinch, having already reviewed the damning evidence hours ago. Silas stood with his arms crossed, a look of absolute disgust directed entirely at my sister-in-law. Jada looked as though the floor had just vanished beneath her custom designer heels. Her mouth hung open, but her vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. The political power she had just threatened me with was utterly useless against recorded federal evidence of intentional wire fraud. I walked slowly around the edge of the polished obsidian table, moving deliberately closer to where she stood, paralyzed against the glass. The sharp clicking of my stiletto heels sounded like a ticking clock counting down the final seconds of her luxurious lifestyle. Last night in the VIP lounge, you threw a glass of red wine at my chest, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal frozen whisper that commanded the entire room. You called me a lowly, ragged accountant. You told me I was a complete failure who did not understand high-level corporate finance. So tell me, Jada, do you honestly think this lowly, ragged accountant knows how to trace encrypted offshore cash flows? I stopped just 3 feet away from her, invading her personal space and forcing her to look directly into my cold, calculating eyes. You thought you were untouchable because you hid behind proxy servers and foreign banking laws. You thought you could steal the life savings of hardworking truck drivers to fund your obsession with status and luxury. But you made one fatal miscalculation. You grossly underestimated me. I tilted my head, studying her absolute terror. I did not just find your stolen money, Jada, I seized it. As of 6 o'clock this morning, Vanguard initiated emergency federal compliance protocols. Every single financial asset attached to your name, your maiden name, and your offshore shell companies has been completely frozen. Your black credit cards are dead. Your private bank accounts are locked. You cannot even buy a cup of coffee right now, let alone hire those powerful Chicago lawyers you just threatened me with. The devastating reality of her total and complete financial destruction finally shattered her arrogant facade. Jada physically collapsed her knees, giving out completely. She slid down the thick glass window, her expensive crimson dress bunching up around her thighs as she hit the floor. The massive diamond necklace she wore suddenly looked like a heavy, suffocating chain around her neck. She was going to federal prison, and she knew it with absolute certainty. A guttural, animalistic sob ripped through her throat, but the sorrow instantly mutated into a vicious, desperate rage. She whipped her head around her wild eyes, locking onto her husband, who was still frozen in his leather chair. You told me this was secure, Jada screamed at Cameron, her voice cracking with sheer hysteria. You promised me the internal servers were wiped clean. You said everything was completely taken care of before the merger. Cameron jolted violently in his seat, his own panic overriding his loyalty to his wife. Shut your mouth, Jada, he roared back, jumping to his feet and pointing a trembling finger at her. You are the one who demanded the Aspen Villa. You are the one who forced me to authorize the transfers. You got greedy. Right there in the middle of the Vanguard corporate boardroom, the perfect wealthy couple began viciously tearing into each other like starving wolves, fighting over a scrap of meat, entirely destroying whatever was left of their pathetic, fraudulent empire. Richard could not tolerate the sight of his empire being dismantled by the daughter he considered worthless. The chaotic screaming match between Cameron and Jada provided the perfect distraction for him to finally snap. With a guttural roar that tore through the pristine Vanguard boardroom, Richard lunged his massive frame across the polished obsidian table. His thick hands reached aggressively for the digital tablet and the master files resting directly in front of me. He intended to smash the evidence to pieces in a pathetic display of brute force to reclaim his dominance. He did not even make it halfway across the glass surface. Silas, standing impeccably still, simply snapped his fingers. It was a sharp, commanding sound that instantly mobilized the two massive Vanguard security operatives stationed by the mahogany doors. They moved with terrifying military precision. Before my father's desperate fingers could even graze the edge of my documents, one guard grabbed him by the back of his expensive Italian suit collar, while the other seized his outstretched arm. They slammed Richard violently back down into his leather chair, the heavy impact forcing a harsh grunt of pain from his lungs. The guards stood firmly over his shoulders, pressing their heavy hands down on his collarbones, rendering the once tyrannical patriarch completely immobile and utterly helpless. Cameron watched his father get subdued and shrank back into his seat, entirely paralyzed by fear. I did not even flinch during the sudden physical altercation. My heart rate remained perfectly steady. I slowly reached out and picked up the second thick folder from the stack of forensic evidence. I let it drop onto the table with a heavy thud. This sound immediately silenced the pathetic bickering between Cameron and Jada. Everyone stared at the new file. I looked directly into my father's terrified, sweating face. "You really thought you could hide a 7-year trail of federal tax evasion from a Wall Street acquisition team?" I asked, my voice cutting through the room with absolute surgical precision. I opened the folder and slid a series of complex financial spreadsheets across the dark glass. "Let us talk about your double bookkeeping methodology, Richard. You maintain two completely separate ledgers since 2019. One ledger was beautifully sanitized for your shareholders and potential buyers like Vanguard. The second ledger, the real one, was a toxic wasteland of fabricated expenses, ghost vendors, and massively inflated operational costs, designed specifically to defraud the Internal Revenue Service. You systematically funneled untaxed corporate revenue into your private offshore accounts while claiming massive depreciation losses on domestic trucking assets that did not even exist. You evaded federal taxes for 7 consecutive years. The sheer volume of this fraud elevates this from a simple corporate misdemeanor to a severe federal crime. You are looking at a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary." The color completely drained from Richard's face. His chest heaved erratically under the heavy grip of the security guards. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, and locked my gaze with his. "Last night in the hotel lobby, you did not hit me because I was being disrespectful," I stated, my voice echoing with chilling clarity. "You did not drag me across the floor by my hair because I embarrassed the family name. You assaulted me because you were drowning in absolute panic." I tapped my manicured fingernail against the financial documents. "That $5 million personal guarantee you tried to force me to sign was never just a temporary bridge loan to cover up Jada's stolen pension money. It was a highly calculated legal trap. You knew the Internal Revenue Service was already auditing your direct suppliers. You knew the federal net was tightening around your double ledgers and your fake corporations. You needed a designated scapegoat. You needed someone completely expendable to take the ultimate fall for your greed. If I had signed that paper, my name would have been legally bound to the exact shell company holding the massive fraudulent tax liabilities. When the federal agents inevitably raided Apex Freight, you and Cameron would have handed them my signature and claimed that the estranged, unstable daughter had orchestrated the entire tax evasion scheme behind your backs. You planned to sacrifice your own child to a federal prison cell just to protect your wealth and your freedom. The Vanguard compliance officers standing behind me remained completely silent, but their expressions conveyed absolute disgust. Silas looked at Richard with the kind of cold contempt reserved for the lowest form of human garbage. "It takes a special kind of monster to breed a child specifically for the slaughterhouse," Silas remarked, his voice dripping with lethal disdain. "You are not a businessman, Richard. You are a parasite." Richard could not speak. The crushing weight of the exposed truth paralyzed his vocal cords. His eyes darted around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face, but he found absolutely nothing. He had spent his entire life building a fortress of intimidation and fear, but I had just dismantled it with a few sheets of paper and basic accounting logic. He realized in that exact moment that I had outsmarted him on every conceivable level. The daughter he had deemed worthless had expertly deciphered his most guarded secrets and handed his head to the executioner without a shred of hesitation. The profound silence in the 50-story boardroom was suddenly broken by a sharp, trembling gasp. Everyone turned their attention to the right side of the obsidian table. My mother Sylvia was clutching her chest as if she were experiencing a sudden heart attack. Her pristine white cashmere coat seemed to swallow her shrinking frame. The master manipulator who had spent her entire life gaslighting me, twisting my reality and protecting her husband's pristine image was finally facing a truth she could not successfully rewrite or ignore. "Allison, what on earth are you saying?" Sylvia stammered, her voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated horror. She looked wildly from my face to the detailed financial documents scattered across the glass table. "Your father would never do something like that. He is a respected man. He would never intentionally frame his own daughter for a federal crime. This has to be a mistake. You are misinterpreting the financial data. Tell me you are misinterpreting the data, Allison." I looked at my mother. I did not feel any anger toward her in that specific moment. I only felt a profound, overwhelming sense of pity for the pathetic, hollow life she had chosen to live. I slowly leaned back in my heavy leather chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I stared directly into her panicked, tear-filled eyes. "Do you really not know, Sylvia?" I asked, my voice remarkably soft, but carrying a devastating weight that shattered her entire reality. "Or did you deliberately turn a blind eye to his monstrous crimes just so you could continue living in your luxurious delusion?" Sylvia stared at me, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The devastating truth had finally penetrated her thick wall of willful ignorance. But this meeting was not about her psychological awakening. It was about absolute corporate execution. Silas moved from his position behind my chair, taking a deliberate, powerful step toward the exact center of the obsidian table. The two massive Vanguard security operatives immediately stepped back, allowing the chairman full, unimpeded access to the thoroughly broken man sitting between them. Silas buttoned his navy pinstripe suit jacket with absolute terrifying calm, projecting the lethal aura of an apex predator who had just trapped his prey in a permanent dead end. Richard Silas began, his voice resonating with an icy authority that commanded absolute pin-drop silence in the massive boardroom. "Vanguard Investment Group operates strictly on a foundation of total transparency and rigorous federal compliance. We do not acquire massive toxic liabilities. We do not absorb highly fraudulent corporate operations. And we certainly do not ever do business with common desperate criminals who steal millions from their own hardworking employees just to fund their pathetic delusions of grandeur and high society status." Silas reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and extracted a sleek silver pen. He gestured sharply to the lead attorney standing in the elite legal phalanx directly behind me. The senior lawyer immediately stepped forward and placed a single sheet of heavy stock paper directly in front of my terrified father. It was absolutely not the $80 million acquisition agreement Richard had been desperately dreaming of for the past 6 months. Effective immediately, Silas declared, his sharp words striking the room like heavy physical blows. "Vanguard is officially terminating all merger negotiations and completely withdrawing our formal acquisition offer for Apex Freight. There will be no $80 million payout today. There will be no lucrative golden parachutes for you or your remarkably incompetent son. Furthermore, my legal team is currently filing a massive civil lawsuit against you and your entire executive board for severe commercial fraud and gross intentional misrepresentation of corporate assets during our active due diligence period." The devastating words hit Richard with the unstoppable force of a speeding concrete truck. The arrogant tyrant who had violently ruled his family and his business with an iron fist physically deflated right before my eyes. His broad shoulders slumped heavily forward, and the last remaining ounces of color drained completely from his face, leaving behind a sickening ashen gray hue. He collapsed heavily onto the polished obsidian table, his large, sweaty hands trembling uncontrollably as they rested near the official termination document he was now forced to stare at. Cameron let out a high-pitched, pathetic whimper, burying his sweating face deep into his trembling hands. Jada sat entirely frozen against the thick glass window, her eyes wide, with unadulterated visceral terror as she fully realized her luxurious upper-class life was officially over. Sylvia covered her face, sobbing quietly into her expensive white cashmere coat. But Richard was not looking at Silas anymore. His panicked, bloodshot eyes darted frantically across the expansive table until they locked directly onto me. He saw the cold, absolute calculation in my gaze, and he finally understood that I held the supreme authority over his entire life, his wealth and his incoming loss of freedom. The brutal realization shattered his massive, fragile ego entirely. The vicious man who had dragged me by my hair across a freezing public parking lot just hours ago suddenly reduced himself to a groveling, pathetic mess. Allison! Richard choked out, his voice cracking with a desperate, begging tone I had never heard him use in my entire 33 years of miserable existence. Allison, please, you cannot do this to me. We are talking about the massive logistics company I built from the ground up with my bare hands. It is our sacred family legacy. He leaned his heavy torso forward across the dark obsidian glass, his shaking hands reaching out toward me in a sickening, nauseating display of completely false parental affection. He completely ignored the severe pain radiating from his bruised collarbones where the Vanguard security guards had violently pinned him down earlier. He only cared about saving his own skin from the federal authorities. "Daughter, please," Richard begged, his deep voice growing increasingly frantic and wildly unstable as the grim reality of his total financial destruction truly set in. "I know I made some terrible mistakes. I know I was too harsh with you last night. But we can fix this right now. We can rewrite the entire corporate structuring today. I will give you equity. I will freely give you 20% of the entire company right now. No, wait. I will give you 30%. You can be the new chief financial officer. You can sit on the primary board. You will have millions of dollars and complete administrative control. Just call off the Vanguard lawyers and immediately destroy those forensic files. Please do not absolutely destroy the legacy of this family." I sat perfectly still in my heavy leather chair, silently watching the ruthless man who had viciously terrorized me my entire life beg shamelessly for his own survival. I listened to his pathetic, desperate offers of corporate equity and executive titles. He was actively trying to buy his way out of a federal prison sentence, using the very company he had already destroyed with his own rampant greed. He actually believed he could purchase my sudden forgiveness with 30% of a rapidly sinking ship. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger. I simply raised my right hand and pointed my index finger directly at my own forehead, highlighting the dark purple bruise. "You called me a failure and threw me out of the house," I stated, my voice freezing the room. "Did you forget? Failures do not know how to share." Cameron sat frozen in his heavy leather chair as the devastating reality of my words washed over him. The promised $80 million acquisition was officially dead. The lucrative golden parachute he had spent months desperately anticipating had just evaporated into thin air. There would be no massive corner office for him to occupy. There would be no prestigious title of chief executive officer to brandish at elite country club dinners. Instead of inheriting a thriving logistics empire, he was now the primary signatory on a sinking ship burdened with $15 million of stolen pension funds and massive federal tax liabilities. His entire luxurious future had been completely eradicated by the exact same sister he had gleefully cheered against while she bled on the freezing concrete just hours ago. The sharp tailoring of his custom suit seemed to suffocate his rapidly heaving chest. His panicked eyes darted wildly around the silent boardroom, frantically searching the faces of the Vanguard legal team for any sign of a bluff. He found absolutely nothing but the cold stare of corporate executioners who had already signed his definitive death warrant. He looked at Jada, who was still crumpled against the thick glass window, sobbing hysterically over her frozen bank accounts. He looked at our father, who was slumped over the obsidian table, completely broken and defeated by his own catastrophic arrogance. The undeniable truth violently fractured Cameron's fragile mind. He had lost absolutely everything. A sickening, animalistic sound erupted from deep inside Cameron's throat. It was not a plea for mercy, it was a raw, guttural manifestation of pure, unadulterated madness. The pathetic whimpering he displayed moments earlier morphed into blind, explosive fury. His face contorted hideously, turning a dangerous shade of crimson as the blood rushed forcefully to his head. The severe mental whiplash of transitioning from an incoming multimillionaire to a guaranteed federal inmate destroyed his rational thought process. He refused to accept that his own supreme incompetence caused his magnificent downfall. In his deeply distorted reality, there was only one person entirely responsible for his total destruction. Cameron violently pushed himself up from his chair. The heavy furniture tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the carpeted floor, but he did not even register the sound. His wild, bloodshot eyes locked directly onto my face, radiating a murderous, lethal intent. His trembling right hand blindly reached across the smooth surface of the polished obsidian table, searching for any blunt object to inflict maximum physical damage. His frantic grasp found the thick-cut crystal ashtray that sat perfectly centered. He wrapped his fingers tightly around the solid glass, gripping it with white-knuckled desperation. He raised the heavy weapon high above his shoulder, vibrating with lethal energy. "You completely ruined me!" Cameron roared, his voice tearing through the silent 50-story boardroom with terrifying feral aggression. He launched his entire body weight forward across the sleek glass table, ignoring the sharp pain as his knees slammed into the hard edge. Saliva flew from his lips as he screamed with absolute unhinged hatred. "I am going to kill you. I will end your miserable, pathetic life right here and right now." He did not care about the elite Wall Street lawyers standing just feet away. He did not care about Silas or the highly trained security personnel. His entire universe had narrowed down to the single violent objective of smashing that heavy crystal ashtray directly into my skull to permanently silence the woman who had stripped him of his crown. I did not even flinch for a single second. I did not scream or raise my arms to protect my face. I sat perfectly still in my padded leather chair, maintaining absolute eye contact with the deranged man leaping across the table toward me. I watched the heavy crystal weapon descending through the air, tracing its deadly trajectory with a cold, clinical detachment. I knew with absolute certainty that the heavy glass would never make contact with my skin. The immense physical tension in the room skyrocketed to a suffocating peak. My mother shrieked a high-pitched sound of pure terror, while my father remained completely paralyzed by his own compounding failures, unable to stop his only son from committing a violent felony. Before Cameron could forcefully swing the heavy crystal ashtray down, the two massive Vanguard security operatives reacted with terrifying and completely overwhelming force. The guard positioned on my right surged forward, moving faster than the human eye could properly track. He intercepted Cameron's outstretched arm with a brutal practiced block, wrapping his thick, muscular forearm tightly around my brother's wrist. With a single sharp and violent twisting motion, the operative forced Cameron's hand to open. The heavy crystal ashtray slipped from his fingers and crashed harmlessly onto the carpeted floor, rolling away into the shadows. Simultaneously, the second security guard lunged across the space and drove his heavy shoulder directly into Cameron's chest, entirely stopping his aggressive forward momentum. The combined momentum of the two massive guards violently slammed Cameron down onto the hard marble floor beneath the obsidian table. The breath left Cameron's lungs in a harsh, agonizing rush as his face was pressed ruthlessly against the cold, polished stone. One guard pinned his arms sharply behind his back, applying excruciating pressure to his shoulder joints, while the other drove a heavy knee firmly into his spine, rendering the screaming, thrashing man completely immobile. Cameron gasped desperately for fresh air, his face heavily contorted in sharp physical agony and absolute ultimate defeat. Exactly at the precise moment my brother was brutally pinned to the ground, the heavy mahogany double doors of the Vanguard boardroom burst open once again. This specific time, it was absolutely not a corporate assistant or another high-powered lawyer stepping boldly through the grand entrance. The harsh morning sunlight caught the unmistakable gleam of solid gold badges pinned firmly to the dark tactical jackets of the elite agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The heavy mahogany doors did not just open, they were commanded to yield. 4 heavily armed federal agents poured into the immaculate 50-story boardroom, moving with a terrifying coordinated efficiency that instantly dwarfed the Vanguard security operatives. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation emblazoned across their broad chests. Their hands rested professionally near their holstered weapons, projecting an aura of absolute state-sanctioned authority. The sheer volume of law enforcement inside the confined glass walls instantly transformed the luxurious executive suite into a federal crime scene. At the center of the tactical formation strode Special Agent Thorne. He was a tall, imposing man with a remarkably calm demeanor and eyes that had spent decades dismantling the most sophisticated white-collar crime syndicates on Wall Street. Agent Thorne did not raise his voice to cut through the heavy, adrenaline-soaked air of the room. He spoke with the terrifying, measured cadence of a man who held the absolute power to strip away freedom. Richard Cameron and Jada Thorne announced, his deep voice resonating off the polished obsidian table and the thick, soundproof glass. "You are all under federal arrest. You are being officially charged with multiple counts of severe wire fraud, intentional federal tax evasion, and the systematic embezzlement of corporate employee pension funds." The heavy metallic clatter of solid steel handcuffs instantly replaced the previous sounds of struggling and shouting. It was a sharp, unforgiving noise that permanently severed the family from their luxurious delusions. Jada was the first to experience a complete and total psychological collapse. The woman who had proudly paraded her custom emerald gown and flaunted her newly purchased diamond necklace suddenly transformed into a frantic, cornered animal. As a female federal agent grabbed her wrists and forcefully pulled her arms behind her back, Jada began to thrash wildly against the glass window. Her designer dress caught on the edge of the leather chair, tearing loudly at the seam. "Do not touch me!" Jada shrieked, her voice breaking into a hysterical, ear-piercing register. "Do you have any idea who my family is? My father is highly connected in this city. You cannot do this to me. I demand to call my attorney right this second. Unhand me!" The female agent did not even blink at the empty political threats. She simply secured the steel cuffs around Jada's wrists with a definitive click, pulling them tight enough to restrict any further movement. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent recited mechanically, her voice completely devoid of any sympathy for the screaming socialite. Jada's legs gave out again, and she was forced to stand only by the firm grip of the federal agent holding her up. The glamorous, untouchable queen of the Chicago elite was officially reduced to a hysterical, weeping suspect heading straight to a federal holding cell. On the floor, Cameron was experiencing a vastly different kind of absolute destruction. The Vanguard security operatives slowly stepped back, allowing 2 federal agents to haul the newly appointed chief executive officer up from the carpet. Cameron was a pathetic sight. His expensive silk tie was torn and soaked with his own sweat. The side of his face was flushed and bruised from being pinned aggressively against the hard marble floor. He did not scream or fight the federal agents as they clamped the heavy metal cuffs onto his wrists. He simply wept. Thick, heavy tears streamed down his face as he choked on his own frantic breaths. His entire body trembled violently, resembling a frightened child rather than a corporate titan. He looked desperately at our father, hoping for some miraculous final rescue, but he found absolutely nothing. Richard sat in his heavy leather chair, resembling a soulless, empty corpse. The booming, tyrannical patriarch who had mercilessly ruled his family with physical violence and endless psychological manipulation was entirely, completely broken. He did not resist when a tall agent firmly grabbed his shoulder and ordered him to stand. He rose from his seat, moving with the stiff, unnatural mechanics of a deactivated machine. His eyes were wide open, but they stared blankly into the empty void of the room, completely unseeing. The $80 million merger, the sprawling logistics empire, the immense wealth and the terrifying authority he had wielded for 4 decades had all evaporated in the span of 30 minutes. When the cold steel of the handcuffs locked tightly around his wrists, Richard did not even flinch. The sharp clicking sound was the final nail in the coffin of his legacy. He was no longer a respected founder. He was merely a disgraced criminal waiting to be assigned a federal inmate number. Sylvia stood paralyzed in the corner of the room, clutching her pristine white cashmere coat as she watched her husband, her son, and her daughter-in-law being systematically shackled by federal authorities. She was breathing in short, frantic gasps, completely unable to process the absolute devastation of her perfect family. She had spent her entire life protecting their pristine image at the severe expense of my well-being, and now she was forced to witness that very image being broadcasted directly into a federal indictment. The 3 restrained prisoners were forcefully turned toward the mahogany doors. But before the agents marched them out into the hallway and down into the waiting fleet of flashing police cruisers, Special Agent Thorne paused. He turned his imposing frame away from the criminals and walked deliberately toward the head of the obsidian table where I sat perfectly still in my heavy leather chair. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath as the veteran federal investigator approached me. Richard Cameron and Jada were forced to halt in their tracks, turning their heads to watch the unfolding scene. Thorne stopped just 2 feet away from my position. He looked down at me, his stern professional expression softening into a look of absolute genuine respect. He extended his large right hand across the polished dark glass. I stood up from my chair, smoothing the crisp lines of my tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit. I reached out and firmly grasped the federal agent's hand, matching his strong professional grip. "Thank you for your extensive cooperation, Ms. Allison," Agent Thorne said, his deep voice carrying clearly across the silent 50-story boardroom, ensuring that every single person heard his next words. "Your forensic report was absolutely flawless. There was not a single loophole left for them to escape through." Agent Thorne nodded to his tactical squad, signaling the immediate extraction of the prisoners. The heavily armed federal agents firmly guided Richard Cameron and Jada toward the heavy mahogany doors. The crisp, sharp clicking of the steel handcuffs echoed off the soundproof glass walls, serving as the final terrifying soundtrack to their completely ruined empire. Jada was still weeping uncontrollably, her expensive makeup utterly destroyed, running in dark, heavy streaks down her face and permanently staining her crimson designer dress. Cameron dragged his feet across the plush carpet, looking back one last time with wide, terrified eyes, resembling a helpless child being sent directly to the slaughterhouse. Richard did not look back at all. He kept his head bowed, staring vacantly at the polished marble floor, a thoroughly broken tyrant who had finally met an unstoppable force he could not bully into submission. The glass doors swung shut behind them, sealing their fates, and leaving behind a profound, heavy silence in the Vanguard boardroom. Only one member of the fraudulent family remained unbound. Sylvia stood completely paralyzed near the edge of the massive obsidian table. The pristine white cashmere coat she wore now looked absurdly out of place, like a fragile ghost haunting the fresh ruins of a collapsed castle. She stared at the closed mahogany doors, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow gasps. The devastating reality of her sudden absolute isolation was crashing down on her with the force of a concrete wrecking ball. For 4 decades, she had hidden comfortably behind her husband's brutal physical intimidation and her son's unearned corporate privilege. She had built her entire identity on being the untouchable matriarch of the Apex Freight dynasty. Now the shield was permanently gone. The wealth was instantly vaporized. The social prestige was entirely erased. She was entirely alone in a room filled with elite corporate executioners who looked at her with unadulterated disgust. Silas adjusted his tailored navy jacket and cast a brief, frigid glance in her direction before turning away, completely dismissing her miserable existence. Panic finally overrode Sylvia's initial shock. The sophisticated high society facade she had perfected over a lifetime shattered into a million jagged pieces. She let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob that sounded entirely manufactured and theatrical. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed heavily onto the expensive carpeted floor. The vicious, arrogant woman who had proudly thrown $100 bill at my bleeding face just hours ago was now crawling across the boardroom floor, desperately dragging her expensive white coat over the spilled vintage champagne and the broken crystal shards. She scrambled frantically toward my leather chair, her manicured hands reaching out blindly. Her fingers clamped tightly around my ankles, her grip surprisingly strong, fueled by sheer absolute desperation. She buried her tear-streaked face against my tailored trousers, sobbing hysterically in a desperate, calculated performance designed to manipulate the only person who held any leverage left in the room. "Allison, please!" Sylvia wailed, her voice cracking with forced, artificial agony. "Allison, I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything. You have to stop this right now. Please tell the federal agents that this is all a massive misunderstanding. Tell Mr. Silas that the financial reports were just a simple clerical accounting error. You can fix this. You have the power to fix this right now." She looked up at me, her eyes wide and overflowing with manipulative tears. Her makeup was ruined, but her mind was calculating every single word, expecting me to instantly revert to the obedient, desperate daughter she had psychologically abused for 3 decades. She genuinely believed she could gaslight a senior forensic accountant into dismissing a $15 million federal wire fraud case as a minor arithmetic mistake? "They are your family, Allison." Sylvia pleaded, her voice rising in pitch. "Richard is your father. Cameron is your own brother. We are your flesh and blood. You cannot do this to us. Blood cannot be severed. How can you possibly stand there and watch your own family be dragged away to a federal prison cell? How can you be so cold and heartless to your own mother after everything we have sacrificed for you?" I sat perfectly still in the heavy leather chair. I did not reach down to comfort her shaking shoulders. I did not offer a single word of maternal reassurance. I looked at the top of her perfectly styled hair and felt an overwhelming wave of absolute clinical detachment. The Vanguard compliance officers watched the pathetic display in total silence, waiting for my command. I slowly and deliberately pulled my legs back, forcing her desperate, grasping hands to slip off my expensive suit trousers. Her fingers hit the floor with a soft, dull thud. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees, and brought my face just inches away from hers. I looked directly into her terrified, calculating eyes, stripping away every last illusion she had left to cling to. "You are absolutely right, Sylvia," I stated, my voice dropping to a lethal, freezing whisper that instantly paralyzed her vocal cords. "Blood cannot be severed. But last night, when my father dragged me across the marble floor by my hair, you followed me out into the freezing, cold parking lot. You looked down at my bleeding face, you dropped a single crisp $100 bill onto the concrete, and you told me to never come home again. You explicitly demanded that I remove myself from your perfect, pristine life permanently." I smiled a slow, chilling smile that made her entire body shudder violently against the floor. "I am just doing exactly what you asked." I stood up to my full height, smoothing the crisp lines of my tailored charcoal gray suit. I did not offer my mother a hand to pull her up from the expensive carpet. I did not offer her a single word of maternal comfort or generic forgiveness. I simply stepped to the side, leaving Sylvia sobbing uncontrollably onto the floor. Her theatrical wailing faded into meaningless white noise as I turned my complete attention toward the heavy mahogany doors. The federal agents were currently processing the 3 shackled prisoners, aggressively marching them out of the Vanguard corporate boardroom. I walked across the room, my stiletto heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The sound was a rhythmic mathematical countdown to their ultimate destruction. I signaled the lead federal agent with a brief nod. He temporarily halted the procession, allowing me to approach the captives for one final interaction. I walked directly up to Jada. The arrogant socialite who had gleefully thrown red wine at my chest just last night was now completely unrecognizable. Her flawless makeup was entirely destroyed by tears of absolute panic, leaving dark, jagged streaks across her face. The heavy steel handcuffs dug viciously into her wrists, forcing her arms behind her back and completely ruining the delicate fabric of her crimson designer dress. She stared at me with wild, furious eyes. Her chest heaved rapidly, but she was entirely physically restrained, unable to raise a single finger against me. I stepped directly into her personal space, invading her proximity with the exact same aggressive entitlement she had utilized against me for years. I leaned forward, bringing my lips just inches from her ear. My voice was a soft, lethal whisper, carefully designed to shatter her remaining sanity and dismantle her fragile ego. "You called my home a slum apartment yesterday," I murmured, ensuring every single syllable sliced deep into her mind. "You mocked my cheap clothes and my sensible lifestyle. You bragged about your massive political connections and your untouchable wealth, but here is the brilliant reality, Jada. That tiny apartment you laughed at was purchased in full with my own clean, legitimate Wall Street capital. I own it outright. I do not owe a single dime to any bank or any proxy investor." I pulled back slightly to look directly into her terrified, bloodshot eyes. "But your luxurious, multi-million-dollar mansion in Chicago and your brand-new ski villa in Aspen. The federal authorities have already seized the deeds as evidence of major wire fraud. Your entire real estate portfolio is dead. Tomorrow morning the bank is coming to violently foreclose on whatever assets are left. You are officially homeless and completely bankrupt." Jada's eyes bulged with pure, unadulterated hatred. Her jaw clenched so tightly, I thought her teeth might actually crack under the extreme pressure, but she could not do absolutely anything to retaliate. The sudden realization that she would be trading her custom designer gowns for a standard-issue federal prison jumpsuit completely broke her spirit. She opened her mouth to scream a furious insult, but the federal agent firmly gripped her shoulder and shoved her forward, instantly cutting off her pathetic attempt to lash out. Right behind her, Cameron shuffled forward like a dead man walking to the execution block. My brother, the fake corporate titan, was completely devoid of his usual blinding arrogance. His expensive suit jacket was torn from being aggressively tackled to the ground by the Vanguard security team. He was weeping openly, thick, heavy tears streaming down his flushed and bruised face. He did not even dare to look me in the eye. When he passed by my position, he flinched violently, instinctively shrinking away from my presence as if my mere shadow could cause him severe physical pain. He was a spectacular failure in every sense of the word, heading straight to a federal penitentiary where his fake executive titles meant absolutely nothing to the prison guards. I did not waste a single breath speaking to him. His absolute pathetic misery was entirely satisfying on its own. He had always been a coward hiding behind our father's wealth, and now he had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Finally, the two federal agents escorted my father toward the exit. Richard moved with a slow, heavy shuffle, completely unlike the booming, tyrannical patriarch who had violently dragged me across a freezing parking lot just 12 hours ago. His broad shoulders were slumped deeply forward, permanently burdened by the massive weight of his exposed crimes. The heavy steel handcuffs clanked sharply against each other, binding the massive hands that had ruthlessly terrorized our family and his employees for 4 decades. I stood perfectly still, forcing him to walk directly past me. He did not raise his head. He kept his gaze locked firmly on the polished marble floor, completely unable to face the daughter he had systematically underestimated and viciously abused. He was utterly defeated and thoroughly crushed by the very person he had confidently labeled a worthless disappointment. The harsh realization that his own flesh and blood had masterfully orchestrated his total financial and personal destruction had permanently extinguished the violent fire in his eyes. He was nothing now, just another white-collar criminal heading to a concrete cell. I followed them out into the grand hallway, standing near the threshold of the 50-story boardroom. I watched with cold, clinical satisfaction as the heavily armed federal agents marched my father, my brother, and my sister-in-law into the waiting private executive elevator. The bright fluorescent lights of the elevator car illuminated their shackled, defeated forms one last time. Jada was still weeping silently, her head hanging low. Cameron was staring blankly at the metal floor, his body trembling. Richard stood like a hollow, petrified statue. No one looked back at me. The heavy steel doors of the elevator began to slide shut with a smooth, mechanical hum. The metallic panels met in the center with a definitive and permanent click. The toxic abusers who had poisoned my entire existence were completely gone from my sight. They vanished down the long, dark shaft, heading straight to a federal holding facility. I stood alone in the pristine, high-rise corridor. A profound, heavy, and absolute silence enveloped the entire space. The wheels of the American federal justice system turn with a slow but absolutely merciless precision that grinds arrogant criminals into fine dust. 6 months after the dramatic, high-profile arrests inside the Vanguard boardroom, the sprawling logistics empire known as Apex Freight officially ceased to exist in the competitive corporate world. Unable to survive the massive public scandal and the immediate freezing of their primary operational accounts, the board of directors had absolutely no choice but to formally file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The once untouchable corporation was systematically dismantled by aggressive federal creditors and ruthless liquidation firms acting under strict government oversight. The massive shipping warehouses were permanently shuttered, and the enormous fleets of commercial transport trucks were auctioned off for pennies on the dollar, just to pay back the stolen employee pension funds. The pristine corporate headquarters, where my father had ruled like an absolute tyrant, was stripped bare of its luxurious furnishings and leased out to a rival logistics firm. The $80 million valuation that Richard and Cameron had so desperately tried to secure vanished into the digital ether, leaving behind nothing but a towering mountain of toxic debt and highly publicized federal indictments that dominated the national financial news networks for weeks. The criminal trials were swift, highly publicized, and entirely devastating for the former corporate elites. Without access to their frozen offshore accounts, my family could not afford the elite defense attorneys they had always relied upon to bully their way out of trouble. Richard stood before a federal judge in a plain, bright orange jumpsuit, completely stripped of his bespoke Italian suits and his booming, terrifying arrogance. The presiding judge showed absolutely zero leniency for a man who had systematically defrauded the Internal Revenue Service and callously stolen the life savings of his own working-class employees. Richard was handed a crushing definitive sentence of 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The tyrannical patriarch, who had demanded absolute submission from everyone around him, was now just another helpless inmate forced to obey the strict, harsh commands of heavily armed prison guards. He would spend the remaining years of his life rotting inside a cold concrete cell, completely stripped of his immense wealth, his authoritarian power, and his precious family legacy. Cameron fared no better in the unforgiving federal courtroom. The pampered golden child who had spent his entire life being handed every single unearned advantage broke down completely during his sentencing hearing. The judge handed him a 10-year federal prison term for his active, willing role in the massive embezzlement scheme and his blatant corporate conspiracy to defraud major investors. The spoiled heir, who had never worked a hard day in his life, was entirely unequipped to survive the brutal, isolating reality of the federal prison system. But the most spectacular and publicly humiliating downfall belonged entirely to Jada. When the undeniable digital evidence of her international money laundering and offshore shell companies hit the local Chicago news stations, her powerful political family reacted with swift and brutal self-preservation. Her father, facing a highly contested re-election campaign, publicly disowned her in a live press conference to completely sever any political ties to the massive financial scandal. Stripped of her prominent family name and her untouchable political protection, Jada faced the ruthless federal prosecutors completely alone. She was firmly sentenced to 5 years in a federal correctional facility for active money laundering and wire fraud. The luxurious Aspen ski villa she had proudly purchased with stolen pension funds was seized and auctioned off by the federal government. Her massive collection of custom Hermes handbags and flawless diamond jewelry was confiscated to pay mandatory federal restitution. The arrogant socialite, who had viciously mocked my cheap clothes, was now forced to wear the exact same cheap, coarse uniform as every other convicted felon. While the architects of the massive fraud sat behind heavy iron bars, my mother Sylvia faced a completely different kind of agonizing permanent imprisonment. Because her name was legally tied to the joint marital assets, she was not spared from the devastating financial fallout of the federal investigation. Under strict federal asset forfeiture laws, the government aggressively seized the sprawling suburban mansion, the luxury vehicles, and the remaining domestic bank accounts. Sylvia was physically evicted from her pristine palace, with nothing but a single small suitcase of basic clothing. The master manipulator, who had spent decades living in absolute luxury, while deliberately turning a blind eye to her husband's monstrous crimes, was violently thrown out into the harsh, unforgiving reality of deep poverty. She was forced to relocate into a tiny, cramped, subsidized apartment on the dangerous outskirts of the city. The elite country club friends she had desperately tried to impress instantly blocked her phone number and completely erased her from their exclusive social circles. She had spent her entire life prioritizing superficial status over the well-being of her own daughter, and now she was completely invisible to society. No one called her phone. No one visited her in that depressing, miserable little apartment. She was left entirely alone to rot with nothing but the haunting, agonizing memories of the luxurious life she had actively helped destroy. Every single day she woke up in that freezing, damp room staring at the peeling paint on the walls, forced to vividly remember the exact moment she chose to drop $100 bill on the ground instead of helping her bleeding child. Their entire untouchable dynasty had been completely eradicated from the face of the earth. The pristine reputation, the massive corporate power, and the generational wealth had all evaporated into absolute nothingness. They had built a towering fortress of arrogance and cruelty, believing they were completely immune to the consequences of their heinous actions. But it only took one single moment of undeniable truth to shatter the foundation permanently. Their entire arrogant empire crumbled to dust, all because of one violent slap on a marble floor, and their catastrophic mistake of completely underestimating the wrong person. The crisp air of an autumn morning swept across the terrace of my new Manhattan penthouse. I stood near the heavy glass railing, wrapping both of my hands around a steaming mug of black coffee. Far below me, the city was just beginning to stir. Yellow taxicabs navigated the grid of the streets like golden blood cells pumping through the concrete veins of the financial district. The distant symphony of blaring horns floated up to my private sanctuary, providing a comforting rhythm to the start of my day. I took a deep breath, letting the clean wind fill my lungs. The suffocating, toxic atmosphere of my childhood, the heavy air of the Apex Freight boardroom, and the freezing hostility of that Chicago parking lot felt like they belonged to a different lifetime. I was no longer the frightened accountant hiding in a battered old Honda Civic. I was standing at the absolute summit of the global financial world, and the view was spectacular. I turned slightly, catching my own reflection in the sliding glass doors that separated the terrace from my sprawling living room. I stepped closer, studying the features of the woman staring back at me. Right above my left eyebrow, a faint, thin silver line traced its way across my skin. It was the only physical remnant of the horrific violence my father had inflicted upon me the night he dragged me across the marble floor of the Ritz-Carlton. The deep purple bruises had faded months ago, and the torn skin had seamlessly healed, leaving behind this quiet testament to my ultimate survival. I did not try to hide the scar with heavy makeup anymore. I wore it proudly, like a shiny medal of honor. It was a daily reminder of the exact price I had paid for my permanent freedom. They had tried to break me physically and psychologically to ensure their fraudulent empire survived. Instead, Their brutal assault had only forged my resolve into unbreakable steel. I took a sip of my dark coffee, letting the bitter taste ground me in the present moment. The magnificent penthouse behind me was completely empty of other people, but it was filled to the brim with absolute undeniable peace. Every piece of custom furniture, every piece of modern art hanging on the pristine white walls, and the coveted property deed itself were secured entirely through my own legitimate earned capital. There were no hidden offshore shell companies financing my luxurious lifestyle. There were no stolen employee pension funds subsidizing my comfort, and there were absolutely no falsified tax records waiting to be discovered by federal agents. I had built my vast personal wealth through relentless dedication, unparalleled forensic brilliance, and an unwavering commitment to the absolute truth. My mother had thrown a crumpled $100 bill at my bleeding face, telling me I would always be a pathetic, isolated failure. Yet here I stood, a highly respected, heavily compensated titan of Wall Street, while she rotted away in a dismal, heavily subsidized apartment entirely erased from the high society she worshipped. The profound, comforting silence of the morning was suddenly interrupted by the sharp, professional ringing of my encrypted corporate smartphone. It rested on the outdoor patio table next to a stack of financial portfolios I had been reviewing. I did not need to look at the caller identification screen to know exactly who was reaching out at this precise hour. I set my coffee mug down on the table, picked up the device, and pressed the green button to accept the secure connection. "Good morning, Silas." I greeted, my voice steady, confident, and ringing with absolute clarity in the cool morning air. "Good morning, Allison," the chairman of Vanguard Investment Group replied, his deep, resonant voice conveying a rare, genuine warmth that he reserved only for his most trusted allies. "I trust the view from your new residence is meeting your rigorous expectations," he asked. "The view is perfect," I answered, smiling as I looked out over the sprawling, sunlit metropolis. "The structural foundation of the building is solid, and there are zero hidden liabilities. I checked the ledgers myself." Silas let out a low, appreciative chuckle. "I would expect nothing less from the sharpest forensic mind in the entire Western Hemisphere. However, I am not calling this morning to simply inquire about your real estate investments, Allison. I am calling to make things official." He paused for a fraction of a second, letting the immense gravity of his next words settle over the encrypted line. "The board of directors met late last night. We held a unanimous vote. Effective immediately, you are hereby appointed as the Chief Risk Officer of Vanguard Investment Group." I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting the sheer monumental magnitude of the promotion wash over me. Chief Risk Officer. I was no longer just an elite investigator tearing down fraudulent companies. I was now the ultimate, uncontested gatekeeper for a global financial empire that managed hundreds of billions of dollars. No major acquisition, no corporate merger, and no institutional investment would ever move forward without my explicit personal authorization. "I accept the position, Silas," I replied, feeling the immense weight of the role. "I will ensure Vanguard remains impenetrable." "I know you will," Silas stated firmly. "Welcome to the absolute top, Allison." The secure encrypted line disconnected with a click. I walked forward, leaning against the heavy glass railing, watching the morning sun break fully over the horizon, bathing the towering Manhattan skyscrapers in brilliant gold. The absolute sweetest, most devastating revenge was not achieved by lowering my morals or resorting to their barbaric methods. The ultimate retaliation was simply turning on the blinding lights and letting the harsh, undeniable truth strip them entirely bare before the unforgiving eyes of the law. I took one final, deeply satisfying sip of my dark coffee, turning my back on the past and stepping confidently into the bright, boundless future. Fade to black. The story of Allison's triumph over her abusive family teaches a profound lesson about the true nature of power and the illusion of toxic familial loyalty. For decades, her family operated under the false assumption that loud aggression, superficial social status, and relentless manipulation equated to absolute control. They truly believed that by constantly belittling her and exploiting the concept of blood relations, they could keep her permanently subjugated. However, the ultimate takeaway is that genuine power does not roar. It silently observes, meticulously calculates, and strikes with undeniable objective facts. Allison's journey brilliantly demonstrates the immense value of silent competence. When faced with brutal physical violence and devastating emotional abandonment on the freezing concrete, she did not lower herself to their chaotic level of screaming or petty emotional revenge. Instead, she weaponized their own staggering arrogance against them. By allowing her abusers to severely underestimate her, she gained the exact leverage she needed to legally dismantle their fraudulent corporate empire. This teaches us that you never have to prove your worth to people who are firmly determined to misunderstand you. Sometimes the most strategic move is to let toxic individuals dig their own graves while you quietly gather the undeniable evidence. Furthermore, the narrative shatters the societal myth that we must endlessly forgive abusive relatives simply because we share DNA. Allison's ultimate victory was not just sending her abusers to a federal penitentiary, it was the establishment of unbreakable steel boundaries. She realized that walking away from a poisoned bloodline is not an act of betrayal, but an act of profound self-preservation. True healing begins the exact moment you stop seeking validation from those who are incapable of giving it, and start investing your energy entirely into your own unshakable success. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relationships to protect your own peace and build your ultimate success? Share your personal journey in the comments below, and do not forget to hit like and subscribe for more empowering stories of resilience and triumph.